last week, as you might remember, we talked about the structure of the Old Testament, how it's divided up into Torah, prophets, and writings, and what each of those mean. Okay, so now let's go to the New Testament, or the New Covenant. Okay, the New Testament is divided up also into sections, just like the Old Testament is. We've got the first 4 books of the New Testament, which we call what? Gospels. And I'm sure you can all name them. What are they? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. After the 4 Gospels, we have one book of history in the New Testament. What's the name of that book? Acts of the Apostles. After the Acts of the Apostles, we have the letters of one particular individual. Paul. Exactly. And after the letters of Paul, we have what are called the general letters, okay, which include the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, Hebrews, James, Jude, all of those. Okay. And the New Testament ends with which book? The book of Revelation. Yeah. Okay. And why do you think they put that book at the end? It was about the end times, right? Yeah. It was about what's it? Okay, so what's going to happen when salvation finally comes to creation? The New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, and there it is. Okay? All right, so what I want to do today is talk about the 4 Gospels. That's as far as we're going to get. First, does anybody know why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got into the New Testament as authoritative documents, and all the other Gospels that were written did not?
They actually experienced it.
Okay, the idea was that you were not considered an authoritative canonical author unless you were an eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection. Okay? So this is how the theory goes. Theory and reality are not always the same, but at the time, and given the information that the early church had at the time, this is what was believed. Number 1, let's start with the beginning. Mark. Now, was Mark one of the 12 apostles? No, he was not. Who was Mark? How did he get in there? Anybody know?
Wasn't he one of the followers of Paul?
Nope. Mark, it was believed, was the secretary for Peter. Peter, remember, Peter was a peasant fisherman from Galilee. He would not have probably known how to write. So he had someone to write for him. Because Peter, of all the apostles, knew everything Jesus wanted anybody to know about him. Okay, whenever Jesus went someplace, sometimes he only took 3 apostles with him. Which 3 did he always take? Peter, James, and John. Yeah. When he was transfigured on the top of Mount Tabor, Peter, James, and John saw that. The others did not. All right? So Peter obviously had a lot to share. So the theory was, and it's based on some documents that where it actually describes Mark as a scribe for Peter, that Mark got the story that he wrote from the mouth of Peter. Therefore, it came from an apostle, therefore it is authoritative. Okay? That's how it got in. Okay. Matthew. Is Matthew one of the apostles? Yes. Okay. So Matthew got in there because it was believed Matthew wrote Matthew. But here's the problem. In the ancient world, did authors sign their names to the documents they wrote? No, they did not. They did not. Okay? How Matthew got identified with Matthew is a story that I'm not entirely familiar with, but somehow or another it did. Okay, so Matthew got in there because they believed the apostle Matthew wrote it. How about Luke? How did he get in there? He was a physician, identified as a physician. Whose physician?
Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Never met Jesus. Luke never met Jesus. Luke was a Gentile. He was not a Jew. Okay, if you read the book of Acts, okay, the story of the early church, the apostolic church, you'll find, I believe it's chapter 16, a transition in pronouns takes place. Now, Luke didn't just write the Gospel Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts. He wrote both. How do we know that? Because we can use computers to analyze language, and you can tell if the same author wrote two documents based on how the language is used. Okay. All right. Luke wrote Acts as well. In that book, he changes the pronouns from Paul and Timothy and so went here, then they went here, and then all of a sudden he starts saying, we went here, and we went there, and we went there. Luke was known to be an associate of Paul's. Paul was an apostle. Was Paul a witness of Jesus' resurrection?
no.
Yes, he was.
We was.
Yes, he was. Because he was on the road to Damascus. Who appeared to him?
Jesus.
Jesus did. Had he been resurrected? Yeah. Otherwise, he wouldn't have appeared to him. So yes, he wasn't a witness to the resurrection. He absolutely was. Paul argues he was an eyewitness to Jesus in his resurrected life.
Okay.
Paul has to argue again and again and again in his letters that he is a bona fide apostle because other Jews claimed he wasn't because he didn't actually know Jesus, nor did he see the crucifixion or the resurrection. He didn't see any of that. So he's always saying, in the book of Galatians in particular, he always, okay, at the beginning of Paul's letters, if you read the beginning, the salutation, Paul identifies himself. Paul, an apostle called by Jesus Christ to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? He keeps emphasizing that so that people understand that he was called by the Lord himself. All right? Now, the theory is that Luke got his information from Paul. Now, how would Paul know, since Paul wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus? Well, Paul on several occasions went to Jerusalem, and who did he meet with? First guy he met with was Peter. He spent 2 weeks with Peter. The second time he met with Peter, James, and John. Okay, so he spent a lot of time with the original apostles. So the idea that the early church had at the time, there's more to it than this, but it was that Luke got the story from a bona fide apostle, Paul, and therefore it was an authoritative book. And finally, John. Why is John in there?
Well, he was an eyewitness to it.
He was an eyewitness. John was the son of Zebedee, right? His brother was James. He was fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus walks by. He says, "Follow me." They leave their poor, aging father with the fishing nets, and they follow him. I don't think Zebedee appreciated that very much. Okay, so that's the theory. That's how those four got in there. All the other gospels that were written were suspect for a variety of reasons, mostly because the content of these other gospels differs from the content of these four gospels. They don't present Jesus in the same way. They present him completely differently. Okay, you wouldn't even recognize who you were reading about if you read these other gospels. Okay, now that's the theory. What's the reality? Okay, here's where your graph is going to come into relevance. All right. So, as you can see there, I put Mark at the top. Does anybody know why I would put Mark at the top? Yes. Mark was the first gospel written. And Matthew and Luke both used Mark. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source?
Because they're similar to Mark's.
Okay, number one, they're very similar. Okay? Scholars, when they looked at these four documents we call Gospels, they could see very easily that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are extremely similar, and John is extremely different from all three. Okay? I go through some of the differences in the essay. You can read that for yourself. All right? So here's what they did. These were primarily German scholars. Okay? They pretend for a minute that this is Matthew, this is Mark, and this is Luke. Okay? Just for the sake of argument. We've got Matthew, we've got Mark, we've got Luke. All sitting side by side. Now you can see how they're the same and how they're different, because you've got them side by side, right? Okay. The first thing scholars discovered was that whenever Matthew and Luke agreed on something, on a narrative of Jesus' life, on something that was happening, whenever they agreed on that, they also agreed with Mark. Okay? Now that can't be a coincidence. So, the idea is that Matthew and Luke Because whenever they agree with each other, they also agree with Mark. They used Mark as one of their sources. Any question?
No, it makes sense.
Yeah, okay. That's number one. Number two. Here's Matthew and here's Luke. Matthew and Luke also have a lot of stories and even some teachings of Jesus in common, none of which are found in Mark. So let's take Mark out of it for now. And by the way, if these two relied on Mark, what does that suggest about when Mark was written? First. Mark was first. Okay. Now you've got Luke and Matthew together. All right? Where they agreed with Mark. Now they agree on a whole bunch of other things too. For example, Matthew and Luke both have versions of the Lord's Prayer. Mark does not. That's one. That's just one. Okay? But there's a lot of others that they have together. All right? I believe the story of the healing of the centurion's slave or son or whatever it was, there's a number of things that they have in common. The Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has it early in his gospel. Luke has it later in his gospel, but the content is the same, except for some varieties that probably have something to do with the fact that Luke's writing, of all four of them, Luke's writing is the most exquisite and artistic. Okay? All right, so if they have material in common with each other that is not in Mark, that suggests that they both also had another source, one that Mark did not have. And if you look at your little thing there, what do you see underneath Mark? With two line Q. Okay. Q is the first letter of the word Quelle, which is the German word for source. Okay? This is a theoretical document. It's not a document anybody has ever seen. But scholars have suggested it must exist or must have existed, because why else would Matthew and Luke have Jesus saying the same things, although with somewhat different Greek? Okay? All right. Now, finally, you're going to find that both Matthew and Luke also have material that is unique to them. Right? There are some things in Matthew that aren't in any other gospel. Remember the parable of the judgment of the nations where Jesus says, insofar as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me? That's in Matthew and it's in no other gospel. Everybody knows the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Which gospel is that in? It's in Luke and it's in no other gospel. How about the parable of the prodigal son? That's in Luke and it's in no other gospel. Okay? The text for this coming Sunday, the parable of the foolish bridesmaids. That comes from, well, we're in Matthew, so you guys should know that. Right? It comes from Matthew. And it doesn't come from any place else. All right, so if you look at your graph, this is the theory. All right, but bear in mind, it's a theory. This is not an exact science, like measuring the speed of light or gravity or something. The theory is Mark was written first. Now, almost 50% of Mark is about the suffering of Jesus, the passion story. So people have suggested that Mark was probably written at a time when Christians were undergoing persecution, because he focuses so much on Jesus' suffering. All right, well, it just so happens that if Mark, in fact, was a companion of Peter, both Peter and Paul were in Rome in the mid-60s, and they were both martyred in Rome in the mid-60s. So it is believed that Mark was probably written somewhere between mid-60s to 70. Okay? All right. Now, since Matthew and Luke were written after Mark, and since it would have taken time, you couldn't go down to a local bookstore and get a book in those days. It took a long time to get a manuscript, right? So Matthew and Luke both come along probably at least a decade after Mark. So we're talking about, anywhere from 75 to, at the earliest, to 85 at the latest. Okay? And you can see what the sources are, how these three Gospels are related to each other. Mark and a source for Matthew and Luke, Q a source for Matthew and Luke, and then there's special Matthew and special Luke. Okay. Now, we're out of time, so, and I ran out of time. I got through this thing. Can you imagine that? I left off with John here too. I didn't get to John. Okay? John was written later than these three, in Asia Minor, Ephesus to be exact. How John came into being and why it's so different, we'll get into next week. Okay? All right, thank you.
Stand for.